about how the idea of best practice is old-fashioned consulting sales nonsense. This is the comment, so I'm going to break it down. First, I want to provide some additional background and context. Once upon a time, the big six accounting firms were the only ones who got the insight into how various organizations were conducting their business, because they would be running financial audits. They would see what passed audit as well as what failed. And then what they would do is they would see the practice that withstood audit. They would take that as a best practice and they'd sell it to other people who didn't have that information. Now, back in those days, workers didn't really bounce around businesses. The workforce is a lot more mobile these days, so people will work at Google and then they'll work at Meta as one simple example. They'll work at Nike and then they'll go to Adidas or Adidas, depending on how you pronounce it, right? But that's a simple example. And then also, thanks to the power of the internet, people who just want to solve shit, they'll put it up, here's a question on the internet, what works for you? And then people answer that question, much like this video and that question, right? But little examples. Now to break it down, leading practices, what works in one business, in one industry, in one vertical doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And I'll use an accounts payable as an example. If you're running a large multinational business, you probably want to have certain managers really quickly have the ability to spend $1 million because they're going to be doing this all the time. It's just part of their job. So you give them that authority and they're just buying stuff constantly. And you have those checks and balances that allow that $1 million spend to get consumed and it's all kosher, right? But if you're in a smaller business, you couldn't possibly try to give someone that same level of delegated authority, even though it might work in that bigger business, that multinational business, right? But there'll be a version of it. So it might be, and I've seen this in smaller businesses, that the executive assistant or certain team members, they can spend up to $3,000, no real question asked, as long as it's relating to a customer project or an endeavor. And that's an example of the best practice for this large multinational might be anyone who's a manager of a certain level can create and approve $1 million purchase orders, but then to tailor it for a different business, you're going to be changing that to, say, a $3,000 limit onto credit cards. And that's one example, because what works in one business isn't going to work in any other. But you can look at the underlying idea of it, which is we want to try to have frictionless purchase order process or procurement processes. And you can then say, well, we have credit cards, and then you apply it to that. That's an example. And there's a lot of other examples, whether we're talking about finance and end of month for recurring journals, if we're talking about payroll and operationalizing, salary increments or bonus process, etc. What works for one place might not work for the other, but you can then tailor it so that you get something close. Hope that